Okay, as I mentioned in the previous video, it would be smart to have your Chapter 4 lab assignment in front of you. You can either print it out and fill it out that way, or you can use, an iPad or computer and annotate the file and upload it that way. But if you have that assignment in front of you, it'll be really easy to go through and fill it out as we go over the specific tissue types. So the first tissue we're going to work on is an epithelial tissue. It's known as simple squamous. So again, simple meaning a single layer of cells, and squamous meaning flat. So this is a single layer of flat cells. Depending on how you look at it, a lot of times it's referred to as kind of a tiled floor, because when you look down at it, the cells don't really look flat, just like a tiled floor. The only reason you know those tiles are flat is you've got a brain and you've figured it out at some point in your life that, tiles on a floor are flat. So this is the single layer. Cells are flat. Where would you find this tissue? So when you're working on your specific tissues, these are the things to keep in mind. A description of it would be, important to know. Be able to identify it. So any of the pictures that are in that lab are fair game pictures. All right. Now some of them are more fair game than others. Like for example, this drawing to me is much better at showing you simple squamous than this actual micrograph image here. Especially since we haven't even learned what this structure is. This is capillaries in your kidney, which we haven't really got there yet. So this is the picture I like to use to see whether you can identify it as simple squamous. So be able to identify it. Know example locations. Now there's a lot of locations. And if you read a textbook, you'd find out all the locations. But try to stick with the ones that I mentioned in this PowerPoint. I'm not going to ask you about locations that I don't mention in the PowerPoint. So locations, the big one is lining the cardiovascular system. So the inner lining of blood vessels, the inner lining of your heart, all has a simple squamous epithelium. And then also the inner lining of the lymphatic vessels as well. Those linings are called the endothelium. So we'll learn more about that in the cardiovascular system. So the endothelium of your cardiovascular system is an epithelial layer. There's serous membranes, which we learned about previously, that are simple squamous in the abdominal cavity and the thoracic cavities. That's called the mesothelium. And then another very important location to know are known as the alveoli of your lungs. So alveoli, which is plural for alveolus, are the little air sacs in your lungs. Now, how are you going to remember that those are the locations? You could memorize, and that might get you there, but there's a lot to memorize. But think about why. All right, why would you need a simple squamous? And the answer is you have to get things into your bloodstream and out of your bloodstream. You have to allow diffusion of oxygen and carbon dioxide from your lungs into a capillary, or carbon dioxide out of the capillary into the air sacs of your lungs. So you're going to need a very thin layer to allow those molecules to go in and out of the bloodstream or in and out of your lungs. All right. So the primary function of simple squamous is to allow diffusion. So to allow things to go in and out. If it was a thick layer, it'd be very difficult to do, say, gas exchange in your lungs or nutrients and waste exchange in and out of your bloodstream. So always try to think about why. Why is it in that location? And it's much easier to remember things when you have a reason and you don't just memorize. Okay, so that's simple squamous. Next one, simple cuboidal. The big difference is instead of flat cells, the cells are square or cube-shaped. Now, this tissue is often used to form little tubes in your body. So your body needs little tubes. We often call them tubules to basically transport things, transport some secretions, transport, for example, sweat from the sweat glands, transport enzymes from your pancreas. So the location is kidney tubules, and again, we haven't really learned about why the kidney has these little tubules. They're actually microscopic within the kidney. It's not these. These are the ureters. We're talking about if we were to cut into that kidney, we would see something like this micrograph. Now, I like this micrograph because it does show a single layer of square or cube-shaped cells. So this would be a little tubule in the kidneys, and we'll learn about the function of those when we get to the urinary system. But for now, we just really need to be able to identify it and know, a couple of the main locations would be these kidney tubules and then what we call pancreatic ducts. And a duct is like a little tube. So this tissue is used to transport secretions by forming tubules or ducts. All right. Next one is simple columnar. So now the cells are not square, they're column shaped or kind of tall cells. These are going to be found definitely lining your GI tract, where you have to be able to bring in nutrients. So lining of the stomach, lining of your small intestines. Quite often this tissue has some of these cellular extensions. So your GI tract has what's called microvilli. So microvilli are these little extensions along the surface that allow you to expand the surface area, right? You have to absorb a lot of molecules from your small intestines. Monosaccharides from your carbohydrates, amino acids from your proteins, fatty acids from your triglycerides, vitamins, minerals. And in order to absorb all that in, you have to have a large surface area. So the function of these microvilli is to expand the surface of your, primarily your small intestine, so you can absorb as much of those nutrients as you possibly can. All right, so those are microvilli. Notice I have, definition over here for you. Increased surface area for absorption. You'll also find another specific cell type known as a goblet cell. So this actual micrograph shows a little goblet cell there. These are the columnar cells. Notice how tall they are. And these goblet cells produce and secrete mucus. So your GI tract is a mucous membrane. It has a lot of mucus coating the surface. So in order to produce that mucus, there are goblet cells. You also have goblet cells in your respiratory tract because it has a thin layer of mucus as well. So function, secretion, absorption of nutrients. You got some mucus along there. If you're in the stomach, you have even more mucus to protect from the acidity. So when we get to the GI tract, we'll learn that the reason why the stomach can tolerate that very acidic stomach acid is because of a thick layer of mucus. All right, so again, you should be able to identify this as a simple columnar and this as a simple columnar. You should know the locations and then the function of microvilli and goblet cells. Some simple columnar might not have microvilli, but maybe it is what we call ciliated. So instead of microvilli along the surface, it might have cilia. And you'll notice these are the exact same pictures of the previous slide because it's very difficult to tell microvilli from cilia. So I wouldn't expect you to know that this is, ciliated or contain microvilli. But I do want you to know that cilia has a totally different function. So cilia is to allow substances to move along the surface. And that could be mucus. So maybe you have mucus production along your respiratory tract and you want to move that mucus up because mucus traps particles. So when you breathe in air, you're breathing in a lot of the particles that are in the air. And those particles will stick to the mucus, and then you use the cilia to kind of move that mucus up towards your throat, and then you actually eventually swallow that mucus. So that's the function of cilia in your respiratory tract. So you're going to find this stuff in the bronchioles, which are part of your respiratory tract. They're the small airways. Uterine tubes have cilia. The uterine tubes are used to move the egg along the tube. You also have some cilia in your brain. In spinal cord, it helps to move the cerebral spinal fluid that circulates through your central nervous system. All right. So again, picture's the same. So, you know, I wouldn't expect you to know ciliated or microvilli, but definitely know the difference between cilia and microvilli. Again, cilia tends to be in the respiratory tract, whereas microvilli tends to be in the digestive tract. Next one is known as pseudostratified. It's usually ciliated, so it's known as ciliated pseudostratified. Pseudo means false, so it's a false stratified. So what that means is it looks like there's many layers. So if you look here, it kind of looks like there's many layers of cells here. But it's actually just a single layer where some of the cells extend all the way to the surface, but others might not. So it kind of looks like it's got many layers. And here they kind of show the little cilia. This tissue, the best place, kind of the classic location, is along your trachea or windpipe. That contains a ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium. And then usually there's goblet cells, so you can see, you know, embedded in here are little goblet cells. By the way, goblet refers to the fact that someone thought they looked like a wine goblet. So a wine goblet is basically like a wine glass because of their shape. I don't know, I wasn't there, but that one to me might kind of look like a wine glass. Okay, so trachea is the location. Function, again, kind of move mucus with the cilia. And again, you should be able to identify either this drawing and possibly this, but this drawing is probably the best for you to focus on. Next one are the stratifieds. So we're going to learn two stratifieds. They're both squamous. And that's because the layers that are towards the surface, so this kind of free surface here, the cells will flatten up. So they decided to name it squamous because of these cells, not the deeper cells. So we have two versions of this we're going to talk about. Non-keratinized and then keratinized. So we first have to learn what keratin is. So keratin is a protein, and it kind of strengthens an epithelial tissue. So you've probably heard of keratin in reference to hair, maybe fingernails, but also the epidermis of your skin. And what it does is it makes your hair nice and strong, makes your fingernails very strong. So we'll learn about the keratinized version of this on the next slide. This is non-keratinized. So many layers of cells. The ones at the apical layers, which are the layers towards the surface, tend to be flat. Where do you find this stuff? Lining your mouth, lining the esophagus, and lining the vagina. All right, so the stratification gives protection. All right, so wherever you have a surface that might, need to be protected, you will often find a stratified layer. So obviously your epidermis of your skin is going to be stratified, but it's keratinized. It's a little tougher than the lining of, say, your mouth or esophagus. And you've probably realized that the inside of your mouth, you can, have cells come off of the surface and you won't bleed. But that's a way to protect your mouth when you're chewing your food, and it might be scratching or you get that abrasion from the food. Same as with your esophagus. As food travels down your esophagus, it might rub along the surface of the esophagus, the inner surface, so you want to protect it. All right, so that's non-keratinized. Keratinized looks identical. All right, looks very similar, many layers of cells, flat towards the surface, but it has keratin, tough, fibrous intracellular protein that helps protect from heat, microbes, and chemicals. So the classic location here, epidermis of the skin. There's a little bit actually in your mouth, like the roof of your mouth. If you kind of feel the roof of your mouth compared to like your cheeks, you can tell that the roof of your mouth is much tougher. That's because of the keratinization on the roof of your mouth. So protection from abrasion, also helps to protect from UV radiation, and it acts as kind of a protective defense against microbes. Next one, and I believe this is going to be our last epithelial tissue, is known as transitional. So this one doesn't use the layers and the shape characteristics. It uses the fact that it changes. All right, so transitional means it'll change. It'll change its appearance based on whether it's being stretched or not. And the location is your urinary tract. All right, whether it's your bladder, the ureters, and the urethra, they all have to stretch a little bit. Bladder is the one that's, a pretty easy one to envision, because you know that your bladder has to be able to expand as it fills with urine. So when your bladder is empty, the lining kind of looks like this drawing. All right, where this, it's really a stratified, but we don't call it that. But it's got some layers of cells. They're kind of square shaped, and then as that bladder fills, oh, by the way, the cells up here kind of have a little bit of dome shape to them. That's another way that they identify this stuff. You can kind of see the dome shaped cells. Then as that bladder fills with urine, it stretches that wall, and the cells start to flatten out more. So it transitions from this appearance to something more like this appearance. All right. So location, again, urinary bladder. Ureters are what transport the urine. So when there's urine in these ureters, it's going to stretch them a little bit. Urethra, when you're urinating, the urethra stretches a little bit. But the obvious one would be that urinary bladder. All right. Okay. Next topic, glands. So a gland is basically, it could be a cell. So like a goblet cell is a gland because it secretes a product. It secretes a secretion, which is mucus, or a mass of epithelial cells. So again, the reason why we're learning about glands right now is they're made up of epithelial cells. Two categories based on what you produce and where that goes. So if you're an endocrine gland, you secrete hormones, all right? And those hormones are eventually going to go more than likely into the bloodstream. Most hormones go into the bloodstream. There's a few that don't, but we learn about that in A&P 2. And if you're going into the bloodstream, you don't need a duct, right? Blood is everywhere. So if all you got to do is put it in blood, there's typically a capillary right there. So you don't need to transport it in any kind of duct, okay? So all those endocrine glands in the endocrine system, pituitary, pineal, thyroid gland, parathyroid glands, adrenal glands, pancreas, those all have endocrine tissue in them. Okay, exocrine. So endo, you want to think inside, right? They go inside the blood. Exo doesn't go into the blood, but it's going to go to some other, fairly distant location. So you're going to need a duct to transport whatever that gland produces, usually to some other location, usually along an epithelial layer. So it could be transporting it to the skin, all right, like sweat or oil. Maybe it's transporting it into a hollow organ. Maybe it's going into the small intestine, or maybe it's secreting something into your mouth, like saliva. Or if you're the pancreas, you secrete enzymes into the small intestine. So some examples of exocrine glands: sweat glands, oil glands of your skin, earwax, digestive glands such as salivary glands, pancreas. Now notice pancreas is here and up here. So the pancreas has both endocrine tissue that produces insulin and glucagon hormones. It also produces enzymes that travel to your small intestine. Okay? Next thing is we have to talk a little more about the exocrine glands and how they produce their secretion. There's three basic modes. So mode of secretion means, how does the gland make that product? How does it make saliva? How does it make oil? How does it make breast milk? And there's three ways. And the terms to know are merocrine, apocrine, and holocrine. So these are all types of exocrine glands, but they differ based on how the material or how the secretion is produced. Merocrine is produced and secreted by exocytosis. So the material, the product, in this case saliva, is produced using your ER, your Golgi, and then it's exocytosed, and then it travels through a duct. You can kind of see there's a little tube here that's going to transport the saliva into your mouth. All right? So the key here for merocrine is exocytosis. All right? In panel B, we're looking at an apocrine gland, such as your mammary glands. So mammary glands produce milk, but it doesn't produce milk and then exocytose it. The cells actually break off. So the key here is the cells of the gland produce the milk, similar way, ER, Golgi, but instead of exocytosing, chunks of the cells get kind of pinched off, collected in the ducts, and then secreted. So mammary glands are apocrine. There's also a type of sweat gland that we're going to learn in the next chapter called apocrine sweat glands. Those are the sweat glands that are in your armpits. So you've got two types of sweat glands. You have sweat glands that are all over the body for cooling the body. Those are actually a type of merocrine secretion. The glands that are in your armpits, that sweat is a little more viscous, a little chunky, and that's because that produces the sweat by apocrine. And then what happens is bacteria start feeding on, some of these, proteins and molecules that are in this chunk of cell, and the bacteria then produce odor. So that's why your armpits stink, but maybe your, forehead doesn't smell. It's because the bacteria are feeding on those chunks that are in the sweat. And then the third method is holocrine. And an example are your sebaceous or oil glands in your skin, which, we'll get to those in the next chapter as well. But oil is produced by holocrine. And what happens is the cells are kind of constantly undergoing mitosis, and then the entire cell, aka the whole cell, a lot of students like to remember holo for whole, so the entire cell dies and becomes the secretion. It'll rupture and break open, but the key there is the entire or whole cell forms the secretion. Okay, last topic in this video under the heading of epithelial tissue are body membranes. Why do we cover membranes now? Because most membranes are epithelial tissue, and there's three basic membranes in the body. Mucous membranes are going to be the ones that produce mucus, but one reason they produce mucus is because they're exposed to the outside of the body. All right, so the cavity or tract opens to the outside, so things can get in, right? Microbes can get in, particles can get in. So to help prevent those particles from getting into your tissues, they're lined with mucous membranes. All right, so respiratory tract, digestive tract, urinary tract, reproductive tracts all have mucous membranes, and they're made up of epithelial tissue. Serous membranes, if you recall, we mentioned those in the past. Those are in cavities that are not open to the exterior. So the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity, and the peritoneum, or your abdomen. And then lastly here we have synovial membranes. Those are in joints. So there's membranes that kind of encapsulate the joint. All right, so they're showing here, this is the knee joint. And you have to have fluid in there. And in order to keep that fluid in there, there's a membrane that forms basically a capsule around that joint. The one big difference between synovial and these other ones is the synovial membranes are actually made up of connective tissue. And we'll talk more about those when we get to the skeletal system and we learn about joints. Okay? So 3 types of membranes. There's actually a 4th. The cutaneous membrane, that's your skin. So your skin is considered a membrane, and it's known as the cutaneous. Oh, my dog is making noise again. The cutaneous membrane. Okay, so that's where we're going to stop this video. We'll pick up on connective tissues in the next video. And this one, next video, connective tissue, is going to have a lot of information. So take a little break. Let the epithelial tissue kind of absorb into your brain a little bit, and be ready for the connective tissues.